Welcome to the MTA International USA Studios in Los Angeles, California for the show of Open Forum. Today we'll be talking about racism. Just to put it in context, there are 13% of Americans are African American, and 14% of drug users, monthly drug users, are African American, yet 37% of those incarcerated are African Americans. Sound logical? Perhaps not. And that's just one fact of many. If we look at education, if we look at incarceration, if we look at what's going on in society, there seems to be a bent towards one way where there still persists this concept of racism. Today we have a great panel with us today. Starting on my right is Isra Siddiq, who's an insurance broker in Chino, California, member of the local board of the Ahmadiyya Muslim Community Los Angeles East chapter, loves to read and play chess. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Next we have Osama Safi, who's a third-year law student and a law clerk at the district attorney's office. Currently he's a law student at Loyola Marymount. He's a columnist for the Santa Barbara Independent and has lots of fun reading and writing. Thank you for being on the show.
Thank you for having me.
And last but not least, we have Ibrahim Naim, who is the interim dean at Pasadena City College, also the former CEO of the Urban League of San Diego. He has 3 sons, 5 grandkids, and is a chocoholic. That's someone who loves chocolate. Thank you for being on the show.
Thank you. Confirmed.
Ibrahim, frame the issue for us. Give us a little bit of history of racism in America, and then we'll talk about what today's state of affairs.
Well, a working definition of racism is the subjugation and domination of one race over another. So it means that all of the systems of that society are geared to benefit one race over the other. And that is pretty much what happened in this society, going all the way back to slavery and coming forward.
So talk about racism against African Americans. Back up all the way to 100 years ago and move us forward.
100 years, well, let's go back to the Civil War.
Okay.
Because after the Emancipation Proclamation and...
What was that?
When Lincoln freed the slaves.
Okay.
After that, slaves were free mostly because in Texas they didn't tell them they were free. So that happened sometime later. But at the same time, what happened after that is a wonderful period of time in terms of Reconstruction, when the right to vote was afforded African Americans and they made great strides politically. As a result of that, we have the rise of the Ku Klux Klan to instill fear, and we also have the introduction of Jim Crow laws, which basically reverse the fact of their citizenship and freedom. And so we came into an era where what was once destined to be a free and open society was again closed off to African Americans.
So there's even after the emancipation, when slaves, African American slaves, were freed, there were all these things that happened. Fast forward to today. Does any of this persist today? One can argue it persists in our criminal justice system, it persists in our education system. Is that true?
Absolutely. The remnants and results of slavery are resident with us even today. I say both within the body of African Americans, the psychological issues and scars as a result of that experience, and also within the minds of the predominant society, because this whole idea of superiority and dominance still resides within the minds of those people who have yet to gain a progressive mindset.
Isra, I mean, couldn't another way of looking at this be that there are folks, what happened in the past, which was in our laws, pre-Emancipation Proclamation, some of these other issues, was a sad period in American history, but yet today we're just being a little extra sensitive. The African Americans are being extra sensitive, and you can find facts to prove anything, but yet we live in a free and open society, so there's no racism today?
I don't agree with that. I mean, we've seen racially motivated murders of Black Americans quite recently. I mean, and just the breakdown of the family structure I think you have to understand that when Africans were brought here, they lost their religion, their culture, their names even. So I think a lot of what we see today is Black Americans kind of reacting to this way they've been treated all these years. So I mean, it's kind of a natural progression, I feel like.
But so you think there's still persistent racism today?
Absolutely, absolutely.
And so I'm going to talk about the criminal justice system. I shared one fact. I mean, is that just a number that you can find numbers to prove anything, or is there something there?
Well, you can't find numbers to prove anything, but there is also something there. If you look at the criminal justice system, if you look at, for example, death row, individuals that will be sentenced to essentially death for their punishment, you'll find that on death row there's much more African Americans than there are people of other races.
Isn't that just because they've committed more crimes?
Well, there was actually a study where Philadelphia was analyzed from the period of 1983 to 1993, and from that period, what they saw was that individuals that committed the same crime, and the only factor was their skin color, African Americans were 38% more likely to be convicted by a jury of their peers. Basically, the community that surrounded them had a natural bias towards African Americans. And as we're seeing here, there's just a history of racism in this country, and that history affects the way we make our decisions, affects the way that we interpret people.
So that's the criminal justice system. I mean, in kindergarten, 12th grade education, or our public education system, that's an unbiased where there's 30 kids in a classroom, a teacher teaches all of them equally, no?
That we would like it to be that way, but it doesn't necessarily translate just that cleanly. You see, racism is oftentimes more subtle, and it's not as so much an overt reality as it is a perception. If I have a bias, that bias is not worn necessarily on my sleeve, but it may show up in the way that I respond to, or even the expectation that I might have of someone. So if someone is biased and they have this prejudice against African Americans or anyone of color, then they would expect less of them. And as a result of expecting less of them, they may give them less by the same token.
Does the data support this theory?
I think we can find some data. Numbers can prove anything.
But in education, I mean, there's this theory of the achievement gap. What is that?
Well, it's very true. We have a serious achievement gap between African Americans, Latinos, with the dominant members of the dominant culture. So there are a lot of things that can contribute to that. Some of which have to do with the paucity of resources, some of which may have to do with the inability of parents to provide the kind of support for their educational, for the youngsters' education, because they may be working 2 or 3 minimum wage jobs to make ends meet. There are it's very convoluted, and it's not a simple subject to approach.
So let me understand, in the education system, there's African American Latinos versus Caucasian. There's a gap in the scores they're getting.
About 30 points.
About 30 points between them. And has this been tested against economics, where just because the lower group may just make less money and therefore they're a little further behind?
Well, it goes across a number of metrics. And so, yes, economics plays a part in it, and so does, of course, ability to read. That's a big issue. By the 5th grade, there's already a definite problem, a gap that's developing in terms of the reading levels of African Americans and Latinos against the other groups. So it's not an easy situation, and I don't necessarily know that it directly relates to racism, but it certainly can relate to bias.
So you've grown up in the Los Angeles, California area. Is this prevalent? I mean, you've felt and touched the society here as one reality checkpoint. How does it unearth itself? How does it show up to someone's daily life?
Well, I mean,
these biases.
How are you asking how they happen, basically,
no,
or
but how do they exhibit themselves? I mean, have you ever seen a racism or a bias? In
Oh,
your
I
daily
mean,
walk?
absolutely. I mean, I've even heard stories. I deal with a lot of people, business people, and I mean, I've even heard stories of certain managers requesting, like say, if there's a staffing agency, right, and then there's a company that hires them to send them workers. I have heard firsthand of managers saying, "Do not send us any African American employees," because of this, misconception of maybe they're not as hardworking as maybe another race of people, or so on and so forth. And a lot of times, I mean, we see it in the job, industry quite often, where maybe if somebody has what somebody may consider an ethnic name or something like that, maybe
Those
their
biases
resume is passed over for somebody else.
So what does religion say about this?
Well,
I mean, are these inherent biases?
from what I understand, all religions teach peace and equality amongst all mankind.
Yeah, and I think that's something that, it's understandable why religions teach that you need to have equality between people of all races, because if you want to progress, if you want to move forward, you have to recognize that there are always going to be people that are not like you, and you have to find ways to work with them in order to create something better.
But this racism in America or other countries, slavery has existed. I mean, religion has been around a lot longer than slavery has. How did that happen?
Well, that's a difficult question, but I'll take the swing at it, because when we look at religions, the farther away from the original message of a religion, from that initial prophet that brought that teaching, the farther away from that we move, the more distortion of that message we have. The less inclined people are to follow that original teaching well, and other teachings creep into that situation. So when we look at religion as a whole, I think all religions are teaching that mankind came from a single person, Adam, and from Adam and Eve, all of mankind originated. So if we look at that, how then, if we really accept that as actually true, then how is it that we can treat anyone other than as a true brother?
What does Islam take one? What does Islam say about racism and biases?
It says that all men are brothers. So then that basically Islam says that in God's sight, the most righteous of you are the best. And so it has nothing to do with skin color or family origin or anything else. And that's I think that's a pretty good measuring stick.
That's a great measuring stick.
And the last sermon that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, gave discussed this issue of you have people that are not going to look like you. That doesn't necessarily mean that you treat them differently than you. You still have to maintain this equality. So I think that kind of foreshadows how big of an issue that this is going to be in society and in the later days that we're now living.
And just to continue that theme, and toward the end of his sermon, he said that those people who were there that day to hear that message were obligated to convey that to those who were not there. So that means that message should be continuing even to this day.
So this day and age, what are there laws in place? Well, we'll start with you, Osama. Are there legal laws in place to prevent some of this from happening? The job that is sort of talked about, where say, I don't want someone who's African American or Latino. I don't want to hire someone based on their race. Is that allowed? Is that legal? At the very lowest bar, not a bias bar, but at the very lowest bar?
Well, it depends on whether it's a private or a government organization that can change the type of restrictions that they can have. But at the very least, I mean, there are certain violations that occur once somebody is discriminating based on race. There are certain laws, of course, that protect that. And as soon as you're explicitly discriminating on race, you're going to be charged with something. But then the issue becomes, well, I'm not hiring this person because of their race. I'm hiring this person because they're a little sloppy and they don't. Right.
The biases show themselves in a non-legal manner.
Right.
So I mean, you're a Caucasian male, but you've grown up in a state that's now approaching over 50% Hispanic. There's a strong African American population in the state as well. So in terms of the minorities are becoming the majority. Do you think this will still persist in California?
Honestly, eventually, I don't think that'll be, because eventually, like you mentioned, what are considered the minority in our country will eventually be the majority. And that's when you're going to see, and we see it, small shadows of it now, of politicians catering to get that vote in a way for they're going to cater to those minorities and whatnot.
And what makes it so interesting is the fact that the United States is this melting pot. It is this land of the immigrants, right? Where you had so many different people come together, originally escaping religious persecution to try to create something new. And what we have, though, unfortunately, is a clash that occurs sometimes. I mean, it's
Great. So what can we do as individuals? How do we, let's go at the lowest form of racism, just a subtle bias. How do I prevent myself from having a subtle bias? There's examples of individuals when you see an African American walking down the street, you lock your door, you walk across the street. Now, it's a bias. I mean, how does one go about preventing themselves from establishing these biases, and what are organizations out there doing about this?
Well, the first thing is to be aware that we all have biases. Nobody is free of them. And to be able to understand that even though I have this bias, I need to be a better person myself. So I need to work on ridding myself as much as possible from any biases that I might have in the sense of fairness. But not only in the sense of fairness, in the sense of my becoming the best person that I can be. So if we all have that attitude of improvement, then we will be more aware and self-monitor.
But how do I stop myself? I mean, I'm walking down the street, and I see someone approaching on the other side. And I'm a little afraid. I walk across the street. Should I stay on that side of the street? I mean, I'm trying to ask for some practical tips as well on what should I be doing. Yes, sir?
I mean, I think it's a common courtesy to say hello to people.
That's a great example.
I mean, it's pretty common sense, but I think when you do that, a lot of times that puts people at ease as well, because you never know, maybe that gentleman may be afraid as well. I mean, you never know what anybody else is
I think you have to be willing to go at least a little bit outside your comfort zone if you have those biases. I mean, one exaggerated example might be that of Malcolm X. Here is a person that saw the white man as the devil, basically. And if you look at it as a subjective experience of what he had, then I guess it makes sense for him. But then he's a person that also did pilgrimage at Mecca, and he saw white, blue-eyed, blonde-haired people serving African-American brothers as Muslims as if they're all one in together. And he was essentially going outside of his comfort zone to a pilgrimage.
But Osama, let's talk about your background. You're of Pakistani descent, and there's a bias. I may be overgeneralizing.
Yeah. And my name's also Osama, post 9/11, so it's not good.
Sure, absolutely. But there's a bias toward lighter skin is considered more beautiful. Mm-hmm. And I mean, does that bias exist? That's a clear bias.
Yeah, I think that definitely does exist. Whether or not it's something that you see amongst your family, or whether or not it's something that you see amongst a culture, whether it's just the Indian Pakistani culture, which is on their televisions or what have you, there's a preference towards people being more fair-skinned. Why?
And fair skin means lighter skin.
Yeah, lighter skin. In fact, that's probably a type of cloaking of it. We don't want to say lighter skin. We say fair skin. It's just It does come into play.
So what can I be doing in my daily life to prevent this, Ibrahim?
Well, one of the things you can be doing is to broaden your horizons, socialize more broadly. I always I always wonder and ask people about, who are your friends? If I get a chance to know your friends, I can have a pretty good gauge on who you are as an individual. And so getting to the individual level, to know someone as a unique personality, I think helps us to get beyond stereotypes. Most of the times we haven't had the kinds of broad socializations. Fortunately today with integration, young people are getting to be socialized more broadly than some of their parents. So this is helping. But each of us should relish the opportunity to meet and learn about other cultures and help break down those misconceptions of stereotypes.
Yes, sir.
I think just to kind of fishtail on what Ibrahim said is that education. And I know it sounds kind of cliche, but if you learn to view people as a people from an origin as opposed to a color or a label, to say, okay, these people are originated from this part of the earth, and this is the culture that they come from. If you can educate yourself, and I think that's kind of like the beauty of what America ideally is supposed to be, is that, you know, like they say, the melting pot. And that's the beauty of it, is that people can come from all over the world, and the commonalities is that humanity. Because regardless of who somebody may hate, you have to acknowledge that our humanity is what unites us.
It's fascinating. Osama?
And I also wonder how much of this is a parenting issue. How much of this is really innate, or how much of this is something that you just kind of come to accustomed to because of what you're used to? If your parents are always describing a certain race in a derogatory term, then are you naturally, of course, going to be inclined towards doing that? Is a white child going to see an African American child and naturally have some type of racism? Or is that not going to come into play?
But how do I, as an African American, not get mad that African Americans are getting 10% longer sentences in prison for the same exact crime as Caucasian, where African Americans or Latinos are being in New York City being stopped and frisked at an over 50, close to 85% higher rate than Caucasian counterparts. As a youth growing up and walking down the street, how do I internalize that, and how do I deal with that in a society where there's a clear bias? It's measurable, it's happening. How do I deal with that as an African American or a Latino?
It is very difficult, and usually this shows up in young African American or Latino males at a certain age, when they have experienced this, when they have seen these exhibits of bias and race and overt racism, then they begin to become angry. And I think the key is to help them understand that there are legitimate channels for the correct
Like what?
expression. Being involved in finding the legitimate solutions to that.
And what did the Urban League, for example, do for that?
Well, the Urban League does a lot of things in terms of trying to break down. One of the focuses of the Urban League is equal employment opportunity, and usually African Americans suffer from a much higher.
Urban League, to back up, Urban League is an organization that does what?
The Urban League is one of the quote civil rights organizations, but it's actually a human service organization, and it promotes employment opportunities.
I see.
For the African Americans, people of color, and the poor.
I see. But so you guys are a little younger. I mean, how do you deal with these biases? If you're and you've lived. I mean, you're Caucasian, but you know enough individuals. How do I living with this day in and day out? Being stopped and frisked, or I know I'm going to get a longer sentence, or I know in my education system I'm not going to be believed in, and there's a 30 percentage point gap when I go to school. I mean, this is persistent in many, many walks of life. When I get a job, someone may ask that not hire me because of my ethnicity. How do I cope with that as an individual? Is there a spiritual solution? Is there a coping solution that you have seen?
I mean, from my personal perspective of people I've grown up with, it might not be fair, but you have to excel. Basically, you have to be better, and you have to take that challenge as you know, if you know you're going to be stopped and frisked, the idea would to be not engage in criminal activity. I mean, if you have that understanding, you know, I've seen it firsthand with people I've grown up with, people that have excelled because they know that they're being judged on a different standard than everybody else.
A higher bar to jump over.
Correct. And at the same time, you also see how it could crush somebody's hope to the point where they give up and they don't want to fight anymore.
And I think you also recognize that there are circumstances where there are people that are worse off than you. I mean, it's not necessarily a zero-sum game. There are also privileges that come across with it. I may be named Osama in a post 9/11 world, but I'm also a man, and because of that, I have certain privileges that I can do that a woman can't do, and that's something to take into consideration, and that's something to really let you have some gratitude
An
as well.
asset-based approach versus a deficit-based
Right,
approach.
right,
I
right.
see. Where does the on the other extreme, the race card? What does that mean? How does one play the race card?
I mean, I don't really like that term because we do see racism so prevalent in this society. You know, to kind of say that somebody is using this as an advantage. I don't see how it's really an advantage if many times we
Got
see
it.
this disproportionate.
It's just not.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Well,
Can that be played?
No, because as I started off by giving the definition, if we see racism as systematic subjugation and domination of one race by the other, if I'm the race that's being subjugated and dominated, how can I, what card is it that I have? I don't have a deck of cards. I can simply call your attention to the fact that you're abusing me. So if I do that, that's not playing a race card, that's common sense.
And standing up for yourself.
Yes.
So once again, let's talk about as a society and as a neighborhoods. What can we do individually to help prevent this from happening in our neighborhoods, in our communities, around the world? This issue exists in countries around the world as well. So what can we do?
I'm gonna suggest something that's very simple. Why don't we all try to smile a little bit more, be a little more friendly, try to treat each person as you would have them treat you? What a novel concept. I think it goes a long way.
It's great. Osama?
And that might entirely change the way that if you see someone of a different race approaching you, if at least they're in a friendly disposition, you're less likely to kind of attribute this negative understanding of that person, right? I mean, if they're smiling at you, then at least it's like, okay, well, this isn't of that category that I think of evil that I have for whatever race X, Y, Z this is. This is just a normal smiling person. And I think that's something that we normally do. We categorize these races into certain things, maybe just for efficiency, right? We see someone of this descent and we attribute this stereotype with it.
Generalization helps
Yeah.
us expedite a process.
Maybe,
huh?
but it does not. It's obviously not helping us. So
Yes, sir.
I think that we have to correct people in our homes, in our group of friends. If we hear or see something that, is not right, people with the proper understanding should address that and say, hey, that's not cool to say. And really kind of address those people and say, where is this originating from? Where does this idea come from? And challenge those people.
And that's hard to do. That's hard to do.
It is.
To be a leader. I mean, if you're with a group of friends and somebody says a derogatory racial term, like it takes a lot of courage to
Takes
stand
work.
up and say, well, guys, it's funny and whatever, but it's not really funny.
Do the right thing.
Right.
Smile.
Right.
Do the right thing.
Right.
And make sure you're a leader and you call it out and stop it wherever you see it. And because there's a spiritual reason for doing this as well. Well, thank you for being on the show. This has been a great conversation. We have had a great conversation on racism, on Open Forum. We learned that the simply smiling more, simply being open and being a leader and calling it out, it's our duty and obligation to erase it in our neighborhood, in our communities, and in our states and countries as we go along. This has been MTA International USA Studios in Los Angeles, California. Thank you for being with us.